Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. I'm told I speak very loudly under the best of circumstances. Thank you so much for your warm welcome and introduction. I'd like to offer my thanks and appreciation to the SSA, and in particular to Dr. Baines for organizing the event and corresponding over the last several months, really, thinking about this. I've been a fan of the work of the SSA for a very long time, since I was a graduate student, what feels like 1,000 years ago, and then now, and the quality of the scholarship that comes out of here is world class, and without it, the book that I wrote would simply not have been possible. So I'm really appreciative of the intellectual communities here in Sri Lanka and how seriously people take their history. Which is one of the inspirational reasons why I care, so much about the history here. What I wanted to say, this might seem like a very strange way, as you say, of approaching Sri Lankan history, or maybe, as my colleagues in the history department might say, any form of history at all. And I think it's in part because the way I engage history is very much through theory as well, and historical theory. Before I jump into this, I want to start by saying, like in Canada, we've developed a tradition of situating ourselves not only to the research, but also to the land on which we live and work and hail from. Now, I'll say I've had an amazing week so far in Sri Lanka. I got here last Thursday. And one of the interesting games that I've been playing with people that I've met all over the place, in Colombo anyway, has been folks trying to figure out who I am and kind of what my deal is and why I'm here. Are you Sinhalese? Are you Tamil? Are you Indian? Are you, what are you? Are you Sikh, Muslim? I've gotten all the questions. Land, cosmology, states, territory, sovereignty, all of these things are actually organizing themes of my research. With your indulgence, I thought I would start this evening by referencing the different lands that have informed my thinking about this concept that's central to what we're talking about tonight, which is pluriversal sovereignty. So I'm going to take you through some slides eventually that's going to differentiate between what I call universal sovereignty and Eurocentric sovereignty, and then present instead this idea of the pluriverse in terms of what that speaks to in terms of sovereignty. More on that soon. So, as was said, I think, thank you. Think of myself as a multi-generational transnational byproduct of empire, the British Empire. And what specifically I mean by that is that my people were displaced originally by British Imperial political economy from modern-day Bihar and Uttar Pradesh in India. And those policies demanded in the 1800s that they stop producing food that they had been doing for thousands of years, and instead produce inedible textiles, so that they could basically participate in the forced development of Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, etc. And for the time being, I only understand my paternal migration story because I know that my father's grandfather signed an indentureship paper that took him from India in 1912 to Trinidad and Tobago. And on my mother's side, they've been on Trinidad as long as they can remember. So that speaks to a historical period that overlaps with this historical period, and this is the global migration of South Asians all over the world, in large part because of the end of the transatlantic slavery in the British Empire, and the introduction then of this new odious system of Asian indentureship that replaced African slavery in the 1830s. Which, as a world-making process, transports South Asians to more than 19 different colonies all over the world. And it does so at a very particular time in political economy, in the history of political economy, because as recently emancipated Africans are now withholding their labor on the plantations, trying to get better conditions of work. In comes the South Asians, unbeknownst to this broader context, and we arrive in all kinds of different places as unintentional scab laborers. And it gives rise, it sows a politics of racial division on these plantations that in much of the rest of the colonies we continue to grapple with today. The fight between, African and South Asian, where the only person who has won historically have been white planters on the plantations. Anyway, the way it plays out in Sri Lanka obviously was a little bit different. There wasn't that formal process of indentureship, but around that same time of the end of slavery, African slavery, the kinds of imperial policies that changed, such as the liberalization of trade duties and the end of monopoly, that actually gave rise to a spike in interest and investment in South Asian plantations. And Sri Lanka was kind of the gem in that situation. It gave rise to the large-scale coffee plantations in the interior. Now, the conditions are different. The Sinhalese public in the interior didn't have the economic requirement to take up employment in the plantations en masse. And this is kind of where possible overlaps between my own genealogy and Sri Lanka might interact, because it was South Indian Tamils that comprised the bulk of the new labor force that came under the Kangani system from the 1830s onwards here. And Tamil migrants were the first, among the first of the continental South Asians to travel all over the world for work, not usually of their own volition. And it's not impossible, I guess I mean to say, it's not impossible that on my mother's side, some of the early migrants to Kairi and elsewhere in Trinidad might have been Tamil, and then that culture been subsumed by the North Indian hegemony in the diaspora. But anyway, that stuff is speculation. Let's return to the things that are true, that we know can be true. So what we know in this time period is that imperial corporate economics cared only for plunder and not for the well-being or even the subsistence of the human beings who toiled on the soils. It was the brutal underdevelopment of India, Sri Lanka, and the broader region under the auspices of one of the world's first multinational corporations, the British East India Company, that India went from being one of the economic pillars of the pre-colonial world to man-made famines, which led hundreds of thousands of my ancestors to sign these indentureship papers and endure dehumanizing labor on the very plantations enslaved Africans worked before them. So this is Can we move it? Can I touch it and move it? Yeah? Okay. There we go. Right. So my specific ancestors ended up on the island of Kairi, which is this one on the left-hand side here. You might know it from cricket, the West Indies. So my specific ancestors ended up here, where the indigenous Taino and Carina peoples discovered a European in the year 1498 named Christopher Columbus, who was kind of floating off the coast. And honestly, in my opinion, they should have let him and his men die of thirst and scurvy. And I say such a cruel thing only because the alternative was the hell that Columbus brought upon these people was something that was otherwise unknown in the Western Hemisphere at this time. Forced labor, slavery, and genocide is what was netted out. That devil Columbus had the audacity to ignore the name Kairi, right? He didn't call it Kairi. Because of his approach, he saw three mountaintops. And the three mountaintops he named for the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, he named it Trinidad. Now, I prefer to think of that as, rather than a holy trinity, I think of that instead of the three processes that territorialize Trinidad, which is indigenous genocide, African slavery, and Indian indentureship, is what gives us this political economy. Um, Enslaved Africans, anyway, they followed in the wake of the genocide, and when slavery was no longer tenable in the empire in the 1830s, my ancestors arrived, indentured ostensibly for 5 years, but then tied through debt bondage for upwards of 20 years to the white planters. Let's see if this works now. Oh, click. Let's go one down. There we go. Okay. So eventually, I found myself growing up on a different set of stolen indigenous territory in a settler colony known popularly as Canada. So specifically, I grew up in a place called Mi'kma'ki, which is on the left-hand side here. You can see the district of Sebanaginig, and in there is the city of Halifax, Chibuktuk, it's called in the indigenous language. The ancestral home of the Ilnu people. And later I lived and worked on Coast Salish territory, which is here in the colonial city of Vancouver, way on the other end, and then also in Algonquin territories in the Ottawa region here in the center. So when I talk to you about the Turtle Island dimensions of today's talk, I'm going to focus on the places, these particular regions. But of course, there's significant other parts of this as well. You know, as a person of South Asian ancestry who was nonetheless already part of 2 diasporic points of disjuncture, being raised in a part of the world that very unproblematically believed in the absolute supremacy of Europe and European people and European culture, the politics of anti-colonialism as an ongoing project is very much sewn into the land that I walk on. Because unlike places in Trinidad, in Sri Lanka, and in India, where we can at least maybe problematically point to a date, we can find a date in history when colonialism comes to an end, there is no such date in the settler colony. So I always ask my students, you know, what is the date that colonialism stops in Canada? And people come with all kinds of different lavish potential answers, but the truth is, especially from the vantage point of those who were here first, the colonial encounter has never ended. So then why, let's go one more. How and why then, how does any of that connect directly to Sri Lanka? You might not be able to read the labels here, I'll read them for you. But note that this map here on the left-hand side from the British Library, it's dated 1801, and it notes that the entirety of the island was ceded to the British. But I posit at the very most simple basis, it could not have been ceded to the British, at least not by the people of the island. You didn't do that. It was the Dutch who did the ceding, fundamentally. And the Dutch didn't even control the majority of the island in this time period, as the British quickly realized. And as Nihil Pereira has argued, at this particular time, the majority of that island, was actually run by Kandy, the last independent kingdom, even if the Dutch had managed to control the maritime regions at this point. So Ceylon, as Sri Lanka was known at the time, was already a land with many thousands of years of sovereign development in the tradition of the Raja Mandala system, which developed in part out of the Buddhist Mauryan Empire around 2300 BCE. And there's several, probably dozens of different ways that we can think about that particular sovereign system. And I'm acutely aware that for the first time, I'm sitting in a room where everybody likely understands Buddhist sovereignty a lot better than I do. Which is not the case when I give talks like this in Canada. So please do feel free to interrupt if I'm saying anything wrong. The main task that I want to accomplish this evening is to demonstrate not my mastery of Buddhist sovereignty, but rather that the diversity of what it means to exercise sovereignty is something we have all lost through colonialism, not just here in Sri Lanka, but internationally as well. And that contamination of natural diversity is what leads us to ahistorical beliefs that in order to practice sovereignty today requires what I call in the book total territorial rule, absolute domination of land and territory. And for my research, there was no place on earth more bone-chillingly relevant to this question of total territorial rule than Sri Lanka, because at the time when I was starting to prepare for my doctoral studies in 2009, it was in that context, can we take the next slide? That then President Mahinda Rajapaksa proclaimed for all the world to hear, we are a government who defeated terrorism at a time when others told us that it was not possible. The writ of the state now runs across every inch of our territory, and it's the second line there that I bold because that's the one that really speaks to this long-term problematic. And we see it on the other side from Professor Yangoda as well, that regardless of whose side you were on this, the war making is fundamentally a process of state making. So the absolute exclusive claims is what's at stake. Can we go one more slide? So my research on the subject of pluriversal sovereignty is motivated by this question. How has the process of becoming modern territorial nation states worked to legitimize and universalize Eurocentric notions of sovereignty while delegitimizing all other forms of sovereignty in all other parts of the world? And the question has been very generative, and it's led me to understand a few things about sovereignty, such as the premise of one's ontological starting assumptions depend very much so on the cosmology on the land in which it arises. So the premise of ontological assumptions in different places, and it has helped me to develop a historical and theoretical method for understanding sites of sovereign ontological collision as critical junctures for study. What I mean for that are the periods in time when different worldviews come into collision. That is a critical juncture that we should be investigating historically, because through looking at the kinds of mishaps, the kinds of overlaps, then we can truly begin to understand what has gone into naturalizing particular visions of state that I'll elaborate on in a bit. Therefore, it makes the territorial nation state seen as the possessor of sovereignty in our contemporary state system the main object of analysis, rather than merely assuming that states as we understand them today have simply always existed. We've all heard this, right? You know, Sri Lanka is a state that's been around for thousands of years. China's been around for 10,000 years. But the thing is, states as a function of the interstate system, none of them have been around for a particularly long time. We are all creatures of modernity, colonial modernity in this sense. So what I do instead is I look for clues to help better understand the violent processes through which universalizing the territorial state continues to produce post-colonial ruptures today. And obviously the Civil War is one very real and recent option. Can we have the next slide, please? But such an approach asks not why the state, but instead when the state. And when the state foreshadows the position that there is a before the state. Before the state, there were many state-like spatial organizations, but the particular confluence of things that give rise to what we might accept as the Weberian state of the international system is really a product of the 19th century, which is very recent indeed. Some trace it back, some argue that we could trace it back to 1648, the peace treaties of Westphalia. But I tend to agree with the geographer and political theorist Stuart Eldon and others who've described Westphalia as being more about reinscribing a European medieval sensibility and cosmology with respect to Europe's political community than it was about some kind of forward-thinking modern project about creating an international system of states. And mostly the reason I believe that is because when we look at the history of race and capitalism as world-making phenomena, we know it, as we know it today, absent the development of capitalism and empire, which were not fully developed forms around the times of 1648, it's impossible to think how we could have ended up at the state system that we currently have. Thank you. So I'm working under the assumption that we're a little bit more familiar with the story of sovereignty as it's told to us in Western state theory, only because that tends to be the only one that they ever tell us about when we study state theory, but we'll talk about it. It's important because our international system is one in which sovereignty is monopolized only by states who have seats at the United Nations with borders that are recognized by powerful outside states. So the state, as we take it for granted, is one that expects to find Eurocentric notions of what land is, of what sovereignty is, and they expect to find it all over the world. And when they don't find it all over the world, then that's a case of underdevelopment, right? Then that's a case of lack of sophistication as opposed to diversity. And it believes that what's true in Europe, what might be true in Europe, must be true all over the world. As I argue in my book and subsequent work on the subject, this assumption is a manifestation of colonial contamination of our diverse pasts, and the future of sovereignty, progressive sovereignty or diverse sovereignty, rests in remembering the things that we have sacrificed at the altar of the Weberian state. So in European, we'll stay with this one for now. In European political theory, state sovereignty is said to reflect the divine right of Christian kings to rule over their lands. And it's not oftentimes told to us this way, right? When we are taught about European state theory, it tends to be taught in a secular way. It tends to be taught as a matter-of-fact kind of way. And they put to the one side the cosmological underpinnings. So I'm trying to bring the cosmological underpinnings more to the foreground here. We can trace the intellectual genealogy of this thought most clearly in international relations through thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And if we wanted to think about the state more clearly, we could even include Hegel, right, and Hegelian state theory. But we can also go the other way and trace back the footnotes. Because if you look at the footnotes from John Locke, specifically Locke's book on property in the Second Treatise on Government, 100% of his source material comes from the Bible. And specifically, not just the whole Bible, but the book of Genesis. And I don't say this as a criticism in this light. I say it only to point that it required no further evidence than reference to a holy scripture, right? So when we present European stories as if they're kind of like natural history or something like that, and then everybody else as a form of mythology, we can see the double standard at stake here. And as you might recall from Hobbes, Hobbes also teaches us that we need to give up much of our freedom in order to entrust to the sovereign protection and so that we can escape a life that is nasty, brutish, and short. So in this kind of Eurocentric model here, and this is the cover of Hobbes's book, The Leviathan. You can see the sovereign is literally comprised of the body politic. His body is made up of the subjects, and he rules over top of the kingdom. He's divinely ordained to accomplish this task. Sovereignty and the state system then is premised on this logic being applied everywhere. And land, the very substance of land that is territory, land has value only when we add value to it in this model. And I'm sorry if this might seem fairly obvious at this point, but I'm going to show you examples where it operates on a different way in a bit, which is why this is relevant. So, yeah. Anyway, let's take the next slide. This one, is a little bit different. The last point I was going to make on that one is that in the European system, the question of who the king is matters a great deal to sovereignty because God has decided who the king is, right? If we take the cosmology seriously. But that's not necessarily the same when we think about a Buddhist cosmology. So the spatial orientation and cosmological groundings are not the same in other parts of the world. And here, when I present this, I'm drawing principally on the work of Sri Lankan anthropologist S.J. Tambaya, Gananath Obesekar, as well as the legal scholar Roshan De Silva Wijaratna, and maybe to a lesser extent, the urban geographers James Duncan and Nihil Pereira's work. So this is my first time talking about this in a context where everyone understands Buddhism already, so I won't belabor the point. Suffice to say, though, that in the Kingdom of Kandy, prior to the arrival of the British, or even overlapping actually with the period of the British, the expectations and historical genealogy of sovereignty were fundamentally different. Like Europe, sovereignty is cosmological, but the geometry of the cosmos is organized differently in South Asia. This isn't just Sri Lanka, this is other parts of Buddhist South Asia as well. And the particular kind of struggle that defined so much of European state sovereignty, this divide over the church and the state, I would argue, and Crystal, maybe you might have a different view about this, I would be curious to hear about it, that secularism, that secular divide, has a different history here. It has no historical significance because cosmology and material practice in the South Asian tradition operates in tandem. That you can't have one, you can't separate them because, while this might be theoretically true in Europe, we should be weary of the Eurocentric tendency to mythologize or render as purely traditional and therefore immodern or not modern forms of sovereignty all over the colonized world. Because this has been part of the modality of colonialism, and then colonialism that turns into development in the 20th century. But the truth is, the European system is just as cosmological as any other system. It's just that the history of European Christians killing each other over territory and religion created a dire need for political secularism that reflects the need of European history at a period in time. I don't want anybody to walk away from this thinking that I'm making a case against secularism today. It's not really about that. I'm trying to understand the modality of the state, the very technical and kind of physical dimensions and expectations of statehood, without trying to pass judgment about what ought to be. So in the European context, sovereignty is hierarchical. And that framing of the absolute sovereign, theologians like Jacques Maritain have explained, have required that the idea that God being above the body politic, like I just showed you, meant that his will is exercised by a sovereign who governs, makes that fundamental question of who the king is the most important if you're a Christian European. Interesting to note that Maritain, a theologian by training, he thinks that's heretical. And he argues that to put a sovereign in that position, as European state theory does, is an affront to God, because that position should exist only for God, because only God is absolute or above the body. Take that whatever way you will. But what's important for the task at hand here is that who the sovereign is less important in a Theravada Buddhist formulation of the question, and the Kandyan kingdom mattered. What mattered more there, I would argue, based on my reading of the history, is what the king did, what the sovereign did, as opposed to who the sovereign was. And we see this in the geometry, right? So Sri Manati in the center, I'll stick to my notes for now, and I'll dispense with the notes shortly, but the king was expected to not just rule as a sovereign, but to rule as a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva king is a person who has lived many lives, and through their experiences in the dharmic cycle of birth and rebirth, attained a level of nirvanic purity such that they are able to attain Buddhahood, but choose not to. And please, again, correct me if I'm misrepresenting any of this, but as I understand this, in the Theravada tradition, to escape the dharmic cycle of birth and rebirth and become one with the universe is the sort of like principal operation of escape, right? Of escaping suffering. And I see it as being ontologically similar to the Hindu notion that I'm a bit more familiar with, of attaining purification through reincarnation and then becoming one with Brahma, or the creative essence of the universe itself. I explain these things not to endorse any one way over another, but to merely show you the distinctions in what is important to understanding sovereignty. And if you consider the relationship between land and cosmology, as we certainly do in Turtle Island, more on that in a second, it seems logical to me that Hinduism and Buddhism would share ontological starting points, even as they diverge quite purposefully, obviously, on a number of things. Bodhisattvas choose not to attain Buddhahood right away, and they reincarnate as leaders in their context to help others caught in the maelstrom of dharmic suffering in the system of birth and rebirth so that more people can escape. And the geometry of the Buddhist polity then centers this principle of Srimanati in the center, intended to be a mirror of nirvanic balance and an educational model for the masses. And it leaves to the outer realms, the day-to-day tasks of statecraft. So it's a different way. Tambaya describes it as a pulsating galactic mandala, where power is spatially organized, always moving, and functionally what that means is that, if someone's asking you for taxes and you live out over here, you might be able to say, as Neera Wickramasinghe has explained in her work on this, oh, I pay taxes to this other sovereign over there. And then the taxman goes away. So I'm not trying to suggest that this is a purely cosmological thing. There's a very real material dimension to this. And what that has meant historically throughout Buddhist South Asia is that there's been a great deal of flexibility and accommodation historically in terms of how statecraft has operated. It has come at the expense of instability. So, we don't necessarily have as much of a history of completely stable dynasties, but that's not a problem in this form of sovereignty because that was never the objective. Whereas in the Eurocentric tradition, the stability is the most important thing. So the argument that I want to stress at this point in the presentation is that what sovereignty means is entirely dependent on the normative, historical, and geographical contexts that have given rise to understandings of how to live politically. And this is not an argument about cultural relativism. It's about looking for the ontological assumptions that are foundational to the epistemological development through which human communities come to know reality itself. Can we take the next slide, please? One back. There we go. This is a scholar named Glenn Sean Coulthard. He's a Dene political scientist. His territory is part of, colonial Canada. And the ontology of land as it exists in Denende, his territory, is altogether different from what we've been talking about in terms of Buddhist sovereignty, in terms of Christian sovereignty. In Denende, land itself is inseparable from people and vice versa. There are relationships between humans and animals and inanimate objects, and he gives examples of this kind of relationality through the relationship between ravens and hunters. And I won't belabor the point. I encourage you to read his book, Red Skin, White Masks, Rejecting the Colonial Politics of Recognition. But his basic argument is that what gives land meaning is your obligation. He calls it grounded normativity. So you have your sense of ethics emerges from the instruction from the land itself. You have obligations to the land, and then the land has obligations back to you. Can we take the next slide, please? This is Anishinaabe scholar Leanne Simpson. This is from the central part of Canada. Her territory is there. And similarly, I mentioned Hindu and Buddhist conceptions of sovereignty had some overlaps. Similarly, Anishinaabe and Dene and Mi'kmaq ones have a little bit of overlap as well. So again, relationships between humans, animals, and inanimate objects are very important. You are not separate from your land. So who you are is tied to the land on which your people have emerged. And Simpson introduces the concept of kobad, which is a linking chain across generations and nations that include, as part of your genealogy, not just your grandmother or your grandfather, but also, again, the trees and the rivers that are part of the land on which you live. So it is impossible to separate yourself from the land here. And then as a throwback then to the kind of Lockean way of understanding land and territory, Simpson argues that we cannot conceive of natural resources, right? Like if you go and you dig and you find sapphires or you find oil, as they do in Canada, that is not a resource for you to exploit. It is a maternal gift. And it conceptually is different because a gift from your mother is going to be treated differently from a resource that can be exploited forever. We can take the next slide. She elaborates on her point here on this essay, Making an Anishinaabe World, that tries to explain some of the differences that speak to the ontological conflict between how Canadians understand land in that Eurocentric way and her people. And she says, they were makers. They got up each morning and they worked hard. Not the white man, wage labor, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 kind of work. Not the kind of work where you go outsource the labor of living so you can do something more important, but the kind of work that values above all else the way one lives. They got up, worked hard all day, and they brought forth more life. In this articulation, you see a completely different vision about how one lives life. To say that it's anti-capitalist, I think, is not even accurate. It is completely separate from the kind of like orientation of capital, because the necessary exploitation of capitalism is not even conceivable in this worldview. We can take the next slide. This is the last ontology that I'll present to you. This is the one that is where I currently live in Mi'kma'ki. This is Doreen Bernard, who is a long-term water protector and grassroots grandmother in the community. And she says, the life, culture, and strength of the Mi'kmaq cannot be separated from the sacredness of water. We embrace our connection to Mother Earth and her lifeblood and our people, and we encourage all to remember that water is precious and that all life depends on it to survive. Again, a Mi'kmaq ontology of land and territory can't be separated from the water, which at times seems counterintuitive because we think about land as being different from water. I'm working on this big project now about climate change and oceans and indigeneity, and one of the first seemingly obvious, but it's always not quite so obvious when you're not thinking in this way, is that the distinction and separation of land and water is itself a colonial compartmentalization, because the Mi'kmaq understand themselves as coastal people to be fundamentally connected to both land and water. So 3 different but related ways of understanding ontology across Turtle Island. Can we have the next slide, please? It draws us to this question that I think is relevant everywhere. Whose conception of land has power and influence to affect the way that we think about not just the past, but the directions for the future? The metaphor of the state of nature, and here, like, I'll ad-lib here a little bit, because this morning I was reading Gananath Obesekar's book on indigenous people here in Sri Lanka, and I only made it into the first chapter, but one of the things that struck me about it was how he was saying when Robert Knox in the 1600s escaped from Kandy and he wrote about the Vedas, he described them as the wild people. He described them, they were people who are closer to the state of nature. And wherever the British, and not just the British, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the French, wherever it is that they were going, from 1492 onwards, when they encountered people that were different from them, they tried to bring them into a Christian understanding of temporality. We see it very vividly and clearly in the Western Hemisphere, in Turtle Island, including the United States, where the excuse for colonization and the debates around land theft there took the form of, are these people even human beings? Or are they something else? You know, there were debates about this. And if they were they capable of becoming Christian? And if they were capable of becoming Christian, then and only then could they not be enslaved. But you see what is happening here conceptually is Europeans are going around the world, and rather than understanding where they are, understanding themselves as equals among many, they're instead trying to subsume people and put them into their own rendering of a past. So the metaphor of the state of nature that we see consistently through Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and others, the metaphor is common because, and I say this, I mean, has anybody read actually the On Property, John Locke's book On Property? I encourage you to look it up and read it because it's kind of amazing to read how in this time period, you know, Europeans could get away with writing whatever they want without having any citations at all. But he really, like, he uses literal examples such as who could argue that the native who gathers water in his cup makes it his, you know? And at some basic level, right, who's going to argue with that? If you grab a drink of water, the water is yours. You drink the water. So conceptually, there's no real problem with that, but it's what gets scaffolded onto it. And his evidence, like I said earlier, all the way back to the book of Genesis, by placing indigenous people into this imagined state of nature, Europeans in this time period, around the time that Hobbes was writing his book in 1648, they had a little bit of encounter with the so-called New World already, right? 150 years. And they were trying to understand so-called natives as being a little bit closer to Adam and Eve. And this is where Hobbes is writing about this. It's where Locke is writing about this. And the reason they write about it in this way is because everybody believed them. So there was no argument to be made, right? Because the rest of us and the indigenous people, our views didn't matter in this time period. We had to fight hundreds of years before our views started to matter again. So Locke's understanding of what land is comes from that Christian worldview in the book of Genesis, and treats it as if it is universally valid all over the world, rather than being geographically situated and cosmologically situated. And it necessarily negates all other understandings of land. But the issue, what I'm trying to say here is not, it might sound like I'm picking a lot on the European system. My point is not that the European cosmology is wrong, only that it is no more right than the rest of the world. The power to represent takes the racist assumptions of dead white European men as being necessarily true, and the lived experiences of indigenous people and people of color all over the world as necessarily mythological. That I have a problem with. We can take the next slide, please. Which brings me to this point of what happens when these ontologies of sovereignty collide. When sovereign systems that are premised on different ontologies meet, they sort of pass through each other. So this is a link to a YouTube video. I don't know if this is, I don't have to show this, but is this connected to the internet? Try to click it and see if it pops up. And if it does, I'll show you. If not, I have, okay, look at that. Magic, okay. So this is where the cover of the book comes from. I'll let you just kind of watch this now. This is an artist's rendition of what's going to happen when the Andromeda galaxy and the Milky Way galaxy, our galaxy, eventually collide in a few billion years. But I want you to see how they interact, because it tells us a lot about how ontology operates. There's the first interaction. See, they pass right through each other, but they've interacted, and now stars from one have mingled with stars from the other, and the gravity pulls them together. They pass through again until finally there's something altogether different, something different than what was there before as the two merge. It's not the same. We can go back to the slides now, please. It's not the same, it's something new was produced through this ontological collision. But the process of that collision was not free from violence. It was not free from struggle. And it was also not netted out in equal terms. If you were living on planet Earth in that hypothetical situation, we would have... Cool.
Create your own website.
Sorry for making trouble.
AI website builder.
Let's go back to the... Yeah. So anyway, if you were on planet Earth at that time, planet Earth is going to get spun out and thrown out of the galaxies altogether, right? Fortunately, we will all long since be dead by then. It won't be an issue. But the point is, when sovereign systems interact, sometimes it can be really great. There's nothing to suggest that when people meet each other, that it has to be violent, that one has to colonize the other. I don't want you to think that I'm arguing that we should never interact. We have always interacted, right? We have always interacted, and most of the time we accommodate. Obesekar actually does a really good job of explaining this, even in the Sri Lankan context, when he talks about analyzing Sinhalese folk theater. And he describes the process of two gods guarding the entry into Lanka, and they don't let people pass through because their Sinhalese pronunciation doesn't sound right, which must be rich hearing me say this right now. But like, eventually the people learn how to speak correctly, and then they are allowed admission into it, right? And Obesekar talks about that as an example of how people were brought into existing processes, whether they were Tamil, whether they were, didn't matter where you were, Arab, and you could have been integrated in different ways. And again, I'm not trying to suggest that that was a wonderful system and we just go back to that. I'm just trying to say there are different ways of thinking about it. So let's take the next slide. And I connect some of this stuff very specifically to the empirical history in Sri Lanka. You probably are familiar with the Kandyan Convention of 1815. This is a period in time that I see as the initial point of sovereign collision in the setup in the book. So it was a time of great pomp and circumstance, the ceremonial arrival of Governor Brownrigg, and he sat right in the king's throne. But it had nothing to do, maybe you already know this stuff, but it had nothing to do with actual military power. It had everything to do with espionage, Eheopola's kind of diplomacy. So what it was just a quick wave. You know the history of this or no? Should I go over this? Okay, I will. Okay, yeah. So what happened, it's kind of an amazing situation. The British have tried and failed many times to take the Kandyan interior in the early 19th century. Eheopola was the Maha-Adhikar of Sri Vikrama Raja Singha, who replaced his uncle, Pilamatave, who had previously tried and plotted against him with John Doyle, the British translator. So Eheopola, what he does, the genius of what he does is he negotiates the terms for the British to march into Kandy, and they don't shed a single drop of blood because Eheopola is going with him and saying, look, it's okay, we're coming to do this thing. And in the British history, they just kind of leave aside the fact that every time they tried to sack Kandy, they got their butts kicked. And then all of a sudden, they had this like Sinhalese aristocrat who managed to get them through without anybody fighting, and they just leave that part in the background. That didn't matter. So what was happening here is actually the Kandyan system was already falling out of galactic balance for reasons that didn't really have much to do with the British. It had to do with the internal dynamics of the court of Kandy. So it was ripe at a time for Eheopola to be able to lead the British in and topple that regime. So when they did this and they signed this accord on the 2nd of March 1815, they were assembled. 3 p.m. they formed a rank. Governor Brownrigg and the Kandyan chiefs ceremonially marched through, and they signed this elaborate accord. And among the things that they signed is the infamous Clause 5 to respect the religion of the Buddha. And that's literally what they wrote in the English, right? And what it does is there's clear evidence, and I documented in the book, that the British in this time period, they have no idea what Buddhism is. They have less of an idea than I currently do, They think it's Hinduism, maybe, The kind of rise of like the kind of classic Orientalist studies are just starting to happen. So they don't really understand. It's not even like classic Orientalist scholarship is not even really available on Buddhism yet. So they don't understand Buddhagama. They don't understand the cosmology that they're interacting with. And we can see that by tracing the archival correspondences between different missionary organizations in the time period. But nonetheless, they recognize that they are engaging with people who understand the world in different ways. There's a recognition of two different temporalities, right? Because for the British, they measure time based on the death of Jesus Christ. The Sinhalese do not. They recognize that in the document. We can take the next slide. So we end up with one document grounded in two different worldviews that are encapsulated as well in the actual written text. And scholars have looked at this, not me because I can't read Sinhalese, but scholars have looked at this and done textual analysis that shows that there are pretty different meanings coming through in English and Sinhalese, and the fact that some people sign their names in Tamil. You know, all of these things tend to get written out of the nationalist kind of histories. Let's take the next slide, please. And this is the principle of galactic imbalance, drawing again from Tambayo to understand what's happening here. So the Kandyan sovereign system was falling out of orbit since around 1800, before the establishment of the consolidation of British power in any case. Pilamatave's crowning of the 18-year-old Sri Vikrama Rajasingha happens in 1798. Scholars have argued, you know, we can talk about this more if you like, but have basically argued that Pilamatave's position was he wanted to control Rajasingha. And that Rajasingha actually ended up being more popular of a king than the Mahadikar believed him to be, and this was part of the issue. In fact, he tried and failed to topple the king himself in, I think it was 1808. And even though he basically raised and educated Rajasingha, Rajasingha ultimately orders his execution in and around 1812. And that's when Eheopola takes his place. And he's, you know, thinking back on the concentric circle model, the Mahadikar came from Uva in the south. So they had a lot of material power. This is what helped them to organize conspiratorial events against the center in Srimanati. But it presents a problem, right? A problem that the Nayak dynasty of kings understood very well, which is that if you were going to be the government of a Buddhist kingdom, you had to Buddhify. You had to demonstrate that you are going to perform the duties and obligations of a Buddhist sovereign. And for the Nayak kings, who were understood sometimes to be as Hindus or Indians or foreigners or what have you, this wasn't a problem for them. Ontologically, this wasn't a problem for them. But King George, head of the Anglican Church of England, now had to become the Bodhisattva king of Kandy in order to have legitimacy. And that poses an ontological problem for the British that was not an issue prior to that. And that fundamental problem at the onset materializes within months in the aristocracy plotting a new rebellion, in the Uva rebellion that we started about. And then if you read Professor Jayawadina's book, Perpetual Ferment, it's really wonderful in documenting how this whole early period of the 19th century is one of constant perpetual ferment and revolutionary spirit. And I trace some of that in the book as well. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is a screenshot of the time of the Kandyan Convention. So they've just collided, they've passed through each other. They're trying to figure out, you know, like what's happening here. Let's take the next slide. And this principle of ontological collision, it's not something that I've made up. It comes from scholarship by Mario Blazer. I know I'm probably talking too long here, so I won't go into details about Mario's work. Only that when I presented this early stuff to him a long time ago, he reminded me, his criticism was, you are treating ontologies as if they don't interact. They're not just banging into each other. That's why I like the galaxies, right? The galaxies. And Mario was quick to say, like people learn from these ontological conflicts. So you can't presume that all ontological conflict is going to be bad. And the example that he gave there is again drawing from Canada, which was a disagreement between Canadian scientists and Indigenous people, the Moachat-Muchalat people on the West Coast. And what the disagreement was about was whether or not the whale of science was all that there is to a whale. I said I wouldn't talk about it, but now it's confusing if I don't tell you about it. So Luna was the chief of the Moachat-Muchalat people on the West Coast was dying and prophesied that he would return to his people in the form of an orca whale. 2 years later, a baby orca whale was separated from its pod and ended up in the exact area where the chief had said that he would return to the people. Environment Canada, understandably, wanted to try to take this baby orca and return it to its pod. But the Moachat-Muchalat said, well, no, the whale is here on purpose. Now, what is the ontological conflict here? It's not that the Moachat-Muchalat disagree with the idea that the whale is the whale of science. They disagree that that is all that the whale is, because for them, the chief has returned through the body of the whale. And again, our position here is not to pick a side and believe, but it's to say, in this worldview, there's one course of action that seems appropriate and another course of action, and it's hard to reconcile them. We don't have to reconcile everything, but we have to understand where they're coming from. So in the end, the people won out, the Indigenous people won out, and the whale was not reconnected with the pod. And 2-3 years later, the whale died. So, you know, we can't really necessarily predict outcomes either. Let's take the next slide. So now here's the galaxies passing through, and I consider this period that perpetual ferment part from the 20s into the 30s up until around the Colbert-Cameron reforms that really seeks to not just transform politically, but also geographically what this island looks like, right? That's where we end up with what the most profoundly kind of colonial geography you can think of is when you look at a diverse place full of nuance and then go north, south, east, west, center and call that the geography, right? What they were trying to do in that time period was to actually weaken the autonomy of the Canadian center by dividing up parts of what was historically Candy and putting it into different administrations. So the geography of control is at play here. Let's take the next slide. So the age of consolidation and insurrection. Archives and even post-colonial histories sometimes describe this time period as just economics, you know, where the plantation economy was happening, the consolidation of the British state. But the period, as I mentioned earlier, is full of revolutionary activity of the British trying to drive, or the Canadians trying to drive out the British and reestablish a Canadian sovereign order. And the British were fixated on acting as if insurrection were simultaneously insignificant, but also they were petrified that the masses would rise up and kill them all. And this is some of the work that I was doing just yesterday in the archives, was reading about some of the insurrectionary attempts that failed. I think the failures actually tell us a lot about what people were thinking and what they were prepared to risk. And in it, the British, you know, they're debating. I was reading the correspondences between the kind of legal authority in Candy and the governor and the legislative council. And what they were trying to do in 1843 was find a way to say, we don't want to try this person, a monk, we don't want to try this monk for treason because then everybody's going to get really upset and he's already really popular. We want to try him for something completely unrelated and then we can deport him to Mauritius. That's what they were like to do with people in this time period. Remove them so that the politics get stunted. So that's what they were trying to do. In the end, they didn't, and then he came back and then started another rebellion, or not a rebellion, but disturbance, as they like to call it. Let's take the next slide, please. And then the second impact here is the Reformation period from the 30s to the 50s. And at this point, by this point in Sri Lankan history, we're kind of reaching the end of the military revolutionary movements. with the 1848 Matale rebellion, which I think is actually much more brilliant, again, than the history tends to. The history tends to describe that as, well, you know, there was like, people were upset about taxes, guns, roads, and all these other tax issues, and that's what they rose up against. But when you read closely what was actually happening, the rebels timed it with the coffee harvest. So they knew that they would have a maximum impact if they disrupted the harvest period for the coffee plantations. And of course, the taxations was a major issue that gave rise to why people were willing to rise up as well. But anyway, I don't want to dwell too much. I know I'm keeping you late here. I don't want to dwell too much on that. We can talk about the details in questions if you like. Let's take the next slide. This is after that period, from the 60s to independence. We have a consolidated period. This is where the norm, I would argue, the norm of total territorial rule and the geography of Ceylon is accepted. And the people are no longer trying to drive the British out and to reestablish an older order. And again, that's not good or bad. It's just describing what's happening. Instead, what they're doing is they're using what they've learned. Because you have to think now, by the time we end up in the 1860s, 1870s, you've got now 2 generations of kids who have maybe grown up and gone to school in the British schools, right? They have different tools at their disposal. They're no longer necessarily like their grandparents now trying to reestablish the Kandyan order. They're saying, well, okay, if the state says that we're going to have mutual respect for everybody's religion, then I'm going to have debates. And there were the great debates, right, around Buddhism and Christianity. But what ends up happening is that people's identities starts to get defined by these things in ways that I don't think they previously were. Not here, not anywhere. So why state and not nation in Sri Lanka? Nationalism becomes the method of anti-colonial struggle in the late 19th century, and for a very pragmatic reason. The insurrections were not successful. So you could, and this is not just Sri Lanka, this is India as well, right? The last great rebellion in India, military rebellion, was 1857, around the same time. Generations of young people, this is what the point that I just said. So the point is, by the late 19th century, people are organizing for total territorial rule over Ceylon, as would be expected to be a sovereign, independent country or empire in the 19th century. But this was a different objective, you see, because it's informed by a different set of ontological starting points from the early centuries. So the grandparents would not necessarily understand the same politics as the grandchildren in this context. Can we take the next slide? How are you all doing? Because I have 2-3 slides about Mi'kmaq to end with, and I can do that, or if you think we have enough talking about Sri Lanka, I'm happy that we can focus our attention on Sri Lanka. Should I continue? Okay, I'll continue then. So, I didn't realize it was going to be quite so much when I put this together. I want to tell you, so what you've seen now is basically what I've done in the book, which is saying, if we understand sovereignty in pluriversal context, meaning we understand that there's lots of ontological starting points from which we need to understand conflict, we can look at our histories and look for evidence of that conflict. We can look for evidence of accommodation in the times that come before us and use that to inform our future political objectives. But now I want to show you what this method of pluriversal sovereignty does for contemporary studies. So I mentioned earlier, Canada is a still colony. We're not a post-colony, we're a still colony. And we have signed treaties similar to the Kandyan Convention since, the 1700s. The presence of peace and friendship treaties in the area of Mi'kmaq, where I live, started in 1725 in earnest. And it's set within a treaty ecology that has actually spanned thousands of years. So Mi'kmaq people, Algonquin people, they have been signing and engaging in treaty work for thousands of years. The British were just one new nation to enter into that ecology of agreements. And there's a dispute over fisheries that blew up in a really violent way a few years ago in Canada when Mi'kmaq fishers decided that they had been waiting for 20, 30 years now for the government to make a decision about a case that had previously gone to the Supreme Court about the Peace and Friendship Treaty from 1725 that said Mi'kmaq people can't have a right to earn a moderate livelihood off of their own land, and that included fishing for lobster, right? So they went to court over this, and the court said the government is wrong, the government has to write new law. The government chose for 25 years not to do anything about it. So the Mi'kmaq people said, okay, well, we know what we're going to do. We have been governing this land for thousands of years. We know how to do this in a safe way. So they set up their own lobster fishery without the consent of the federal government at all, and started going out and fishing. Now, this created a problem for the white fishermen, because the white fishermen are subject to Canadian law, federal law, and they had to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for their licenses and this and that. And it gave rise to a conflict where the white fishermen said, this is ridiculous. They can't fish outside of the lobster season. They're going to get all the lobster. And then the indigenous people are saying, we're only going to take a logical amount to sell a small amount, et cetera, et cetera. It led to violence in the streets, people. Like white people, we can take the next slide. The case study here, it provoked what I call colonial cognitive dissonance, because you had this situation where Canadians, on the one hand, we like to say unceded territory like I started here, but on the other hand, we want to domesticate indigeneity and say you have to operate under Canadian law or else. And this is what we saw here. The white fishermen were burning lobster pounds. They were attacking indigenous people who were trying to fish. They were ramming boats. They were destroying equipment, and all with impunity. The government did nothing to stop them. They didn't even charge them with assault and destruction of property. So this is my stick figures here. One of them says, I recognize that I'm on unceded territory, but everybody should follow the rules or else anarchy and stuff. And then this person's logically trying to say, but mobs of white people killed lobsters to conserve lobsters that Mi'kmaq fishers caught following their own rules. Because that's the other hypocrisy, right? The argument was the ecological argument that we have to not fish lobsters outside of lobster season because otherwise we're going to hurt the lobster stock. So then they burned down the lobster pounds and killed all the lobster. It doesn't make a lot. It's cognitively dissonant. If we take the lens of pluriversal sovereignty and understand this, the ability of disciplines to come to terms with the fact that everyday enactments of sovereignty happen globally is not the failure of the Mi'kmaq, was not the failure of the Canadians. It's the failure of settlers and of scholars to accurately understand the world as it is. The reality of the world is not the one that exists neatly in our scholarship. The reality of the world is the one that's practiced. So Mi'kmaq worldviews, just like Canadian worldviews, they are not backwards. They are not superstitious. They're grounded in an ontology that exists beyond the limit of a Eurocentric universe. You can take the next slide. And indigenous scholars in particular go to great lengths to lay out what this looks like. I'm not going to get into all the details here, but this is an article that tries to address the issue of conservation, but from a Mi'kmaq ontology worldview. And it lays out, and I encourage you to read it, it's an open source article so everybody can read it. And the one that I'm highlighting here is the Mi'kmaq principle of Ituapmunk, which means two-eyed seeing and strong like two people, which literally tries to bring these two different worldviews together and presents a kind of Western worldview as one eye and a Mi'kmaq worldview as a second eye, and argues that we see and understand problems better together when we can bring them together, because not everything has to be, violent. Let's take the next slide. And yeah, this is the last concluding one here is, where I'm taking this research, what I try to do with this is to produce decolonial options based on understanding sovereignty in pluriversal terms. And the kind of takeaway points here is that, if we think about ontological collision as critical junctures, it helps us focus areas to do research. And that can be both contemporary, like the Mi'kmaq fisheries, which is what this article is about, or it can be historical, when we think about, like the Kandyan Convention. And I'm encouraged by scholarship, Sri Lankan scholarship, like Roshan De Silva's work, because one of the things that his work does quite well, I find, is it looks to the sovereign system of Kandy and then tries to say, well, what if we applied some of these accommodations today in the 21st century Sri Lanka? What might we be capable of producing in terms of accommodations if we learned from our own past as opposed to, the British system and just saying, the British system. And I leave that task ultimately to you all, right? To Sri Lankans to decide what Sri Lankans are going to do in their own country. I terrorize Canada relentlessly because I'm a Canadian citizen, and that's my purview over there. That's why I stick to the past when I study this region. But ontologies are not beliefs. They're the starting assumptions. They're the very seeds and foundations upon which more complex epistemologies emerge. And then the last point I'll leave you with is that decolonization is always a material process, as we've seen here, but rarely is it ever a linear process or even a dialectical process. We have to kind of follow the natural paths and rhythms when they take us in places that might make us uncomfortable, and especially when they take us in places that we did not previously conceive. Because the truth of it is, I started this talk saying that I'm a transnational byproduct of empire, but all of us are, right? We are all byproducts of our histories. And if we limit ourselves to the things that we expect to find, we're not going to be able to remember the things that we need to help us confront the enormous task of decolonization. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.